I sat still as the last car rolled out of the driveway. The air felt heavy, soaked in the scent of lilies and stale coffee. My husband's funeral had ended, and with it, the final thread of what used to be our life. I didn't cry. Not now. I had done all my crying in the weeks leading up to today. What remained was silence, vast and unbroken. For 25 years, he had been my anchor. He was the one who made the coffee too strong, left his socks everywhere, and rubbed my back without asking when I was tired. He was my annoyance, my partner, my constant. Now, there was just his empty recliner and his half-read book on the nightstand. I sat at the edge of the dining table, the one he had built himself in the garage years ago. My fingers traced the grooves in the wood, each dent a reminder of meals, arguments, and laughter long gone. I didn't know how to be alone. Not really. And the loneliness was no longer just a feeling. It had become a presence, a cold thing draped around my shoulders. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting my son, but it was his friend, Eli. I hadn't seen him in years, not since their graduation. He had filled out, taller now, broader shoulders, hair shorter. He wore a clean black suit and held his hands in front of him, awkward but respectful. "Sorry for your loss," he said gently. "Thank you," I replied, offering a small, tired smile. He lingered, unsure. I noticed how he looked at me, not with pity, but something softer, gentler. He reminded me of my son in his early 20s, open-hearted, not yet calloused by life. He had always been the quieter one in their group, polite, thoughtful. "I always admired how strong your husband was," he said. "He talked about you a lot." The comment landed strangely. Not in a bad way, but in a way that stirred something in my chest. I nodded, unsure how to respond. My hands returned to the table, tracing patterns again. "Do you want some tea?" I heard myself ask, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want the quiet to return. Maybe I didn't want to feel invisible just yet. He followed me into the kitchen. We moved around each other slowly, silently. The kettle hummed. I passed him a mug. His fingers brushed mine just a second too long. I felt it. He pulled back quickly, eyes down. I told myself it was nothing, that I was tired, that my emotions were playing tricks. But when he looked up again, his eyes didn't match the soft tone of his voice. They lingered, held something that felt like acknowledgement. Something that saw me, not the widow, not the mother, but me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt warmth. Not comfort, not healing, just warmth. And it was enough to keep me standing. Eli returned the next afternoon, carrying a grocery bag. He said he figured I hadn't had the energy to cook and thought I might appreciate a home-cooked meal. I should have declined, but I didn't. I thanked him instead, too surprised by the gesture to object. He moved around the kitchen like he belonged there, asking where I kept things, careful not to overstep. I sat at the counter and watched. There was something steadying about his presence, like he was filling the silence without trying to erase it. I hadn't realized how starved I was for company that didn't come with condolences or rehearsed concern. As he stirred the sauce, he asked about my husband. What had he been like before the illness? What I had loved most about him. I answered without breaking. I spoke of strength, loyalty, the quiet way he had loved me. But I noticed the way Eli listened, his eyes never leaving mine, as if every word carried weight. As if he wasn't just hearing, but absorbing me. Then he told me he'd lost someone, too. Not a spouse, but a sister. Years ago. The pain, he said, never really leaves. It just changes shape. I looked at him and nodded, not because I agreed, but because I knew he understood. It was the first time in weeks someone hadn't tried to fix me with words. After dinner, we sat on the couch. He asked how my son was handling everything, and I told him the truth. He was burying it, same as I had expected. I mentioned how quiet the house had become since he'd gone back to college. Eli said I didn't have to be alone. Just like that. Not in a suggestive way, but it stayed with me all the same. There was a pause then, heavy and filled with something unsaid. He looked at my hands, folded neatly in my lap. Slowly, like he was afraid to startle me, he reached over and placed his hand over mine. It was warm, steady. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I just let it stay there, and when I looked up, his expression was unreadable. Kind, but unreadable. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "I just didn't want you to feel invisible." I felt something in my throat catch. Not sadness. Something closer to relief. The smallest flicker of being seen, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman. A person still capable of being noticed, wanted, even if only briefly. When he left, I stood at the doorway longer than necessary. He turned back once, like he wanted to say more. But he didn't. And I was grateful. Because whatever this was, whatever line we'd just towed, had been real enough without being named. I closed the door with my heart beating faster than it should have, not from fear or guilt, but from something dangerously close to longing. He came again 3 days later, without warning. Said he'd been thinking about our last conversation. There was a tension in the air, quieter than desire, louder than comfort. I didn't ask why he was really there. I already knew, and I didn't stop him from coming in. We sat without speaking for a while. He noticed the broken cabinet door under the sink. Said he could fix it. I told him not to bother, but he knelt down anyway, tools from his car in hand. I watched from the table. His shirt stretched across his back as he worked, arms moving with quiet confidence. I caught myself staring. I didn't look away. When he stood, wiping his hands on a towel, I handed him water. Our fingers touched again. This time longer. His eyes met mine, searching. I looked away, ashamed at how familiar this moment already felt. He didn't say anything, just sat across from me. "You don't talk much about yourself," he said. I told him there wasn't much to tell. But then I spoke about how I'd married young, how being a wife and a mother became all I knew. How I'd forgotten what it felt like to be touched for no reason, to be seen without being needed. I didn't mean to say that last part, but it came out. His expression didn't change. Just more stillness, more silence. Then, almost gently, he said, "You haven't disappeared, you know." The words hit harder than I expected. I didn't realize how invisible I'd felt. How grief had blurred my edges. I stood to clear the dishes. He followed. As I turned, I stumbled slightly and he reached out instinctively, steadying me with both hands on my arms. Neither of us moved. He was too close. I could smell the faint hint of his cologne, clean and understated. My breath caught. His fingers tightened just slightly, then loosened. We didn't kiss. We didn't say a word. But something passed between us, sharp and irreversible. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of the way his eyes had softened, how his presence made the house feel less haunted. I told myself it was just attention, just comfort, that I was lonely and he was kind. But it wasn't that simple. I wasn't just craving company. I was craving feeling, warmth, aliveness. This wasn't a game. There was no seduction. Just two people staring at a line they weren't supposed to cross, knowing they already had. Emotionally, it had happened. The guilt didn't land immediately. Not yet. Because in the quiet of my grief, he was the first thing that made me feel like I hadn't been buried alongside my husband. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a widow. I saw a woman who had been loved, left behind, and suddenly noticed again. Not out of pity, but with intent. I didn't know what to do with that recognition. Only that I wasn't ready to let it go. I didn't expect to see him again, but I hoped. And when he showed up that evening, there was no explanation. He just stood there waiting. I stepped aside without a word. Whatever hesitation we had before was gone. The silence between us was no longer uncertain, it was charged. He sat across from me, the space between us thinner than ever. We didn't talk about the past, or my husband, or the funeral. That part of the story felt closed, as if acknowledging it now would only distance us. What existed between us had its own gravity, one that didn't require permission or labels. I asked him if he was afraid of what this meant. He shook his head and said, "Are you?" I couldn't answer. I wasn't afraid. I was awake for the first time in a long time. I had spent weeks wrapped in memories, in routines built around a man who no longer existed. But tonight, there was only the present. He reached for my hand, and I didn't hesitate. His thumb moved gently over my palm, the smallest motion, but enough to unravel what restraint I had left. I leaned in, not with urgency, but with clarity. Our faces hovered close. The kiss didn't come immediately. It wasn't about lust. It was about confirmation that we were really here and that we both knew the weight of what we were about to do. When our lips did meet, it was soft, deliberate, almost hesitant. But it deepened, slowly, with certainty. And in that moment, nothing else lived in the room. Not guilt, not judgment. Only the echo of breath, the quiet unraveling of grief into something warm, human, and deeply flawed. We didn't speak afterward. There was no apology, no promise. Just stillness. He looked at me, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who had already saved herself by choosing to feel again. It wasn't about replacing my husband. It wasn't about filling a void. It was about rediscovering a self I had abandoned, one that still wanted, still reached, still responded. I walked him to the door. He didn't ask if he could stay. I didn't ask him to. That wasn't what this was. This was a moment, not a future. But as he stood on the porch, he touched my face gently, and I let my eyes close. I memorized it, not out of hope, but because I knew this would be the moment that stayed with me. After he left, I sat on the couch alone again. But the silence wasn't so cold. I wasn't unraveling anymore. I wasn't anchored to a memory. I had stepped beyond mourning, beyond obligation, into something raw and real. I didn't regret it. I didn't label it. I just knew it happened. And somehow, I felt more alive than I had in years. The grief hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. I had shifted. And there was no going back.